The wind howling across the Wyoming plains had a voice of its own, a hollow, mournful sound that cut through heavy coats and settled deep in the marrow of a man's bones. Eli Turner adjusted his hat low over his eyes, squinting against the biting grit carried by the gust. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Buster, snorted and tossed his head, eager to be out of the weather and inside the warm confines of the stable. It had been a long 3 days. The ride to the cattle yards in Laramie and back was grueling even in fair weather, but with the sky turning the color of a bruised plum and the temperature dropping, every mile felt like 10. Eli had sold 30 head of cattle, enough to keep the ranch afloat through the winter and buy the supplies packed tightly in his saddlebags. It was a solitary victory, one he would share with no one. As the ranch house came into view, a small timber structure sitting defiantly against the vast emptiness of the grasslands, Eli felt the familiar tightening in his chest. It was not a relief. Relief implied there was comfort waiting for him. This was merely a cessation of travel, a return to the silence he had carefully constructed around himself. He rode past the main house toward the large barn that stood 50 yards to the west. The wooden structure groaned under the assault of the wind. Eli swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting the frozen earth with a heavy thud. He led Buster toward the barn doors, his leather gloves stiff with cold. That was when he stopped. The latch on the small side door was undone. The heavy iron hook dangled loose, clinking softly against the wood in the gale. Eli froze, his instincts sharpening instantly. He was a man who lived by routine and order. He never left a door unlatched. The wind could not lift a heavy iron hook. Someone was here. Eli dropped Buster's reins, trusting the horse to stand, and reached for the Winchester rifle scabbard attached to his saddle. He slid the weapon out, the metal cold and familiar in his grip. He levered around into the chamber with a sharp, mechanical click that sounded violently loud in the quiet evening. He moved toward the door, stepping carefully to avoid the crunch of dry gravel. He pushed the wood inward with the barrel of his rifle and stepped into the dim interior of the barn. The smell of dry hay, old leather, and horse manure greeted him, usually a comforting scent, but now tainted with something else. The air felt disturbed. The dust motes dancing in the shafts of failing light seemed agitated. "Come on out," Eli called out, his voice rough from days of disuse. "I am armed, and I have no patience for thieves." Silence answered him, save for the scratching of a mouse in the rafters and the wind whistling through the gaps in the siding. Eli moved deeper into the barn, checking the stalls. His milk cow, Bess, chewed her cud placidly in the far corner, but her ears were swiveled backward, listening to something behind the stack of hay bales near the loft ladder. Eli approached the hay, the rifle stock pressed against his shoulder. He saw a depression in the loose straw, a shape that did not belong. "Last warning," he growled. The pile of hay shifted. A gasp, sharp and terrified, cut through the air. Eli lowered the barrel slightly but kept his finger near the trigger as the straw fell away. He expected a drifter, perhaps a cattle rustler looking to lay low, or maybe a desperate thief from town. He did not expect a woman. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rough wooden wall of the barn, her eyes wide and wild with panic. She was small, painfully thin, and shaking so violently that her teeth chattered audibly. Her dress, a flimsy thing of pale blue cotton that might have once been elegant, was torn at the shoulder and hem, stained with mud and grease. She was barefoot. Her feet were raw, red, and swollen, bleeding onto the clean straw. Eli stared at her, momentarily stunned, the rifle lowered further, though he did not uncock it. "What are you doing here?" She flinched at his voice, raising her hands as if to ward off a blow. Her arms were slender, the skin pale, marred by dark, ugly bruises that bloomed like storm clouds against the white flesh. "Please," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Please do not hurt me." The raw fear in her tone struck Eli like a physical blow. He took a step closer, trying to get a better look at her face in the shadows. She had dark hair, matted and tangled, falling over a face that was etched with exhaustion. "I am not going to hurt you," Eli said, his voice dropping an octave, though it remained gruff. "But you are trespassing." "Who are you?" "I just needed to rest," she stammered, her eyes darting to the rifle and then back to his face. "I did not know. I thought the place was empty. Please, I will go." She tried to push herself up, but her legs gave way. She collapsed back into the hay with a soft cry of pain, her head lolling forward. Eli swore under his breath. He engaged the safety on the rifle and leaned it against a support beam. This was a trap, his mind whispered. A woman like this, out here in the middle of nowhere, dressed like that, it screamed of a setup. He glanced around the barn again, half expecting men to jump from the loft, but the barn remained empty. It was just her. She was shivering so hard now that it looked like a seizure. Hypothermia was setting in. If it had not already claimed her, he could not leave her here. Not even a dog deserved to freeze to death on a night like this. "You cannot stay here," Eli said, moving toward her. "You will freeze before morning." She shrank away from his reaching hand, squeezing her eyes shut. "No, no, please." "I am taking you to the house," he said firmly. "Do not fight me." He reached down and scooped her up. She was alarmingly light, nothing but bone and trembling skin. She felt like a bird that had flown into a window, fragile and broken. As he lifted her, her head fell against his chest, and she went limp. She had passed out from the exertion of fear. Eli carried her out of the barn, shouting a command for Buster to follow him to the corral. He quickly stripped the saddle off the horse and turned him into the paddock, promising him a proper grooming later. Then, clutching the unconscious woman against his heavy wool coat to shield her from the wind, he made for the cabin. Inside, the air was stale and cold. He kicked the door shut behind him and carried her to the single cot near the stone hearth. He laid her down, her muddy dress staining his quilt, but he did not care. He worked quickly, driven by the practical necessity of survival. He built a fire in the hearth, stacking kindling and logs until the flames roared to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. The warmth began to bleed into the room, chasing away the chill. Eli approached the cot. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged. He hesitated. Her dress was wet and filthy, clinging to her skin. If she stayed in it, she would never get warm. But he was a man living alone, and the propriety of the situation gnawed at him. He compromised by retrieving 2 heavy wool blankets from a chest at the foot of his bed. He wrapped her tightly, cocooning her layer upon layer until only her face was visible. He pulled a chair close to the fire, grabbed his rifle, and sat down. The hours ticked by in the silence of the cabin. Outside, the wind battered the walls. But inside, the only sound was the crackle of pine logs and the woman's uneven breathing. Eli watched her. In the firelight, she looked incredibly young, too young to have eyes that held that much terror. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but did not drink it immediately. He turned the glass in his calloused hands, the amber liquid catching the light. The solitude of the ranch usually felt like armor, a shield he had forged to keep the world at bay. But tonight, with this stranger sleeping in his bed, the armor felt heavy. His mind drifted, unbidden, to the past. It was a dangerous place to go, but the presence of another human being in his house had unlocked doors he usually kept bolted. He thought of Samuel, 5 years ago. This ranch was full of noise. Samuel, his younger brother, had a laugh that could fill a valley. They had built this place together, driving cattle up from Texas, dreaming of an empire of grass and beef. Then the accusations came, cattle rustling. It was a lie, spun by the greedy land barons who wanted the water rights to the creek that ran through the Turner property. They needed a villain, and they painted the Turner brothers as thieves. Eli remembered the night the sheriff came, not to arrest them, but to warn them. Or so he said. It had been a setup. A posse waited in the canyon. Samuel had been shot in the back while trying to parley. He died in Eli's arms, choking on blood, while Eli returned fire, dragging his brother's body into the brush. Eli had been arrested, beaten, and thrown in a cell for 6 months while the investigation dragged on. In the end, there was no proof, only the word of men who owned half the county. They let him go because they could not hang him without a witness, and the witness, a hired hand with a guilty conscience, had vanished. But the damage was done. The town looked at Eli with suspicion and hatred. He was the rustler who got away, the man who got his brother killed. When he returned to the ranch, he found it looted, the stock scattered. He rebuilt it alone, fueled by a cold, hard rage. He spoke to no one unless necessary. He trusted no one. He became the ghost they whispered about in the saloons of Laramie. And now, another ghost had washed up on his doorstep. The woman stirred, moaning softly. Eli sat up straighter, his hand instinctively resting on the rifle. "Water," she whispered, her eyes still closed. Eli stood and fetched a tin cup of water from the bucket. He knelt beside the cot and lifted her head gently. "Drink," he commanded softly. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. Her eyes fluttered open, finding his face. For a moment, there was confusion, and then the terror returned. She tried to scramble back, but the blankets held her. "Easy," Eli said, backing away to give her space. "You are safe. You are in my house. I found you in the barn." She stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked around the room, her gaze landing on the fire, then the rifle, then back to him. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Eli Turner. This is my ranch." "Eli?" She tested the name, as if tasting it for poison. I am Lila." "Lila," Eli repeated. "Who did this to you? Lila?" She went rigid. Her hand came up to touch the bruise on her cheek, her eyes darkening. "Nobody. I fell." "You did not get those bruises from falling into a pile of hay," Eli said flatly. "And you did not tear your dress or walk until your feet bled because you were out for a stroll." "I cannot tell you," she whispered, pulling the blankets tighter around herself. "Please do not make me tell you." Eli looked at her for a long moment. He saw the wall she had put up. He knew that wall. He had one just like it. "Fine," he said, standing up. "I do not need to know, but you cannot stay here." Her face crumpled. "I have nowhere to go." "That is not my problem," Eli said, his voice hardening. He had to be hard. Softness got people killed. "I live alone. I cannot have a woman here. It is not proper, and it is not safe. When you are strong enough to walk, you are leaving." Lila looked down at her hands, nodding slowly. "I understand. I will go. Just let me rest tonight." "Tonight," Eli agreed. "Sleep. I will take the chair." He did not sleep that night. He watched the fire, and he watched the door, listening to the wind scream like a banshee, wondering what kind of hell this girl had crawled out of to end up in his barn. Morning broke with a gray, sullen light that offered no warmth. The wind had died down, but the air was heavy with the promise of snow. Eli fried bacon and corn cakes in a cast-iron skillet, the smell filling the small cabin. When he turned, he saw Lila sitting up on the cot, watching him. She looked like a specter, pale, hollow-cheeked, her hair a dark halo around her face. He plated the food and set it on the small table. "Eat." Lila hesitated only a second before she practically fell out of the cot and sat at the table. She ate with a ferocity that was painful to watch. She used her fingers, tearing the bacon apart, shoveling the corn cakes into her mouth as if she feared the plate would be snatched away. Eli poured coffee into 2 mugs and sat opposite her. He watched her eat, noting the way her hands shook. The bruises on her arms were vivid purple and yellow in the daylight, marks of fingers that had grabbed her with cruel force. When the plate was clean, she looked up, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. She seemed to realize her lack of manners and flushed. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I have not eaten in 3 days." "It shows," Eli said. He took a sip of his coffee. "Where are you from?" She looked away, staring out the small window. "Town, Laramie. That is 20 miles away," Eli said. "You walked?" She nodded. Eli felt a grudging respect mixed with his suspicion. 20 miles in this weather, barefoot, was a death march. She had a will to survive. He would give her that. "I meant what I said last night," Eli said, setting his mug down. "You cannot stay." Lila's shoulders slumped. "I know." She pushed herself away from the table and stood up. As soon as she put weight on her feet, her face twisted in agony. She gasped and grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling. "Sit down," Eli barked. "I can walk," she lied through gritted teeth. She took another step, and a fresh spot of blood bloomed on the wooden floorboards. Eli stood up and crossed the room in 2 strides. He gripped her arm, gently, and forced her back into the chair. He knelt and lifted the hem of the blanket she had wrapped around herself like a skirt. Her feet were a ruin. Blisters covered her heels and soles, many of them burst and bleeding. The skin was frost-nipped, white and waxy in places. "You are not walking anywhere on those," Eli said, his voice low. "You would not make it a mile." "I have to," she said, panic rising in her voice. "He will find me." "Who?" She clamped her mouth shut, shaking her head. Eli sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He was trapped. He could not throw her out, not like this. It would be murder. "You stay until your feet heal," Eli said, the words tasting like ash. "But you work for your keep. I am not running a charity." Lila looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I can work. I can cook. I can sew. I will do anything." "Just rest for now," Eli said, standing up. "I have chores to do." He grabbed his hat and coat and fled the cabin, needing the cold air to clear his head. The days turned into a week. The weather held, hovering in a gray limbo. Inside the cabin, a strange, fragile routine began to form. Lila healed slowly. For the first 2 days, she could barely hobble from the cot to the fire. Eli brought her water and food, speaking little. He spent his days out on the range, checking fences and breaking ice on the watering troughs. By the 4th day, Lila insisted on helping. She cleaned the cabin, sweeping the floor until the wood shone. She took over the cooking, turning Eli's simple rations of beans, bacon, and flour into meals that actually had flavor. She found a jar of dried herbs in the back of the pantry and used them to season a rabbit stew that was the best thing Eli had eaten in years. They spoke in fragments. Eli learned that she was 19 years old. She had no family. Her parents had died of fever when she was a child. One evening, while she was mending a tear in one of his work shirts, she spoke of the saloon. "I was 14 when he bought me," she said softly, her eyes on the needle flashing in the firelight. Eli paused in the act of oiling his boots. "Bought you?" "My father owed money. When he died, the debt passed to me. The owner, Mr. Sterling, he said I could work it off." She gave a bitter, dry laugh. "The interest was always higher than the wage. I was never going to leave." Eli looked at her, his jaw tightening. He knew of Sterling, a man with a silver cane and a heart made of coal. He owned the Golden Spur in Laramie. "He hurt you," Eli stated. It was not a question. Lila did not answer, but her hands stilled on the fabric. The silence was enough. The tension in the cabin was a living thing. Eli was a man accustomed to silence, but Lila's presence filled the space. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. There was a quiet grace to her movements, despite her injuries. She was like a wild thing that had been beaten into submission but was slowly remembering how to lift its head. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. Eli had been up before dawn, chopping wood. He came inside, stomping the snow off his boots. Lila was at the stove, the coffee pot in her hand. "Coffee is ready," she said, turning to him. Eli walked over, reaching out to take the cup she offered. He moved quickly, his hand coming up in a sharp motion to grasp the handle. Lila gasped. She dropped the cup. It shattered on the floor, sending hot brown liquid splashing over her skirts and his boots. But she did not look at the mess. She had thrown her arms up over her face. cowering back against the hot stove. Her body curled tight in anticipation of a blow. I'm sorry, she cried out, her voice high and shrill with terror. I didn't mean to, don't! Eli froze. His hand was still suspended in the air. He looked at the shattered cup, then at the woman cowering before him. The realization hit him with the force of a physical strike. She thought he was going to hit her, because she dropped a cup, because she made a mistake. Someone had beaten her for this. Someone had taught her that a clumsy hand resulted in pain. A cold fury rose in Eli's chest, hotter than the fire in the grate. It was not directed at her, but at the invisible man who had put that fear in her eyes. He slowly lowered his hand. He did not move toward her. He made himself smaller, slouching his shoulders, keeping his voice soft and steady. Lila, he said. She was trembling, waiting for the strike. Lila, look at me. She lowered her arms by inches, her eyes wide, swimming with tears. She looked at his hands, checking for a fist. It is just a cup, Eli said. It is just coffee. I am not going to hit you. She stared at him, her chest heaving. But I made a mess. We will clean it up, Eli said. I have more cups. I have more coffee. You are safe here. He crouched down and began to pick up the shards of pottery. After a moment, Lila sank to her knees beside him. She reached for a piece of the cup, her hand shaking. He used to, she started, then choked on the words. If I spilled, he used to use the cane. Eli's hand tightened around a shard of clay until it dug into his palm, the sharp pain grounding him. He is not here, and you will never see him again if I have anything to say about it. They cleaned the floor in silence. When they stood up, something had shifted. The wall between them was not gone, but a door had been cracked open. That afternoon, the sky finally surrendered. It started as a few lazy flakes, drifting down like feathers. Within an hour, it was a white curtain, thick and blinding. The wind picked up, howling around the eaves of the cabin with renewed fury. Eli went to the window and looked out. He could barely see the barn. The drifts were already piling up against the fence posts. Is it bad? Lila asked from the fireplace, where she was stirring a pot of beans. Eli turned to look at her. It is a nor'easter. This snow will not stop for days, and even when it does, the drifts will be 10 feet deep in the passes. Lila went still. The road to town? Gone, Eli said. We are cut off. He saw the fear flicker in her eyes again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the fear of being hit. It was the fear of the cage. For how long? She asked. Until the thaw, Eli said truthfully. Or until I can dig us out, but that could be weeks, maybe months. He watched her process this. She was trapped, but she was also safe. No one from town could get here either. The snow was a prison, but it was also a fortress. We are stuck together. Lila, Eli said, moving away from the window to warm his hands by the fire. Best get used to it. Lila looked at him, then looked at the fire. She wrapped her arms around herself, not in fear, but in thought. Okay, she whispered. Okay. Outside, the world disappeared into whiteness, erasing the road, the tracks, and the path back to the life she had fled. They were alone in the vast, frozen silence of the Wyoming winter. Just a man with a hollow heart and a woman with a broken spirit, circling each other in the warmth of the firelight. The snow did not stop for 4 days. The world Eli had known, a vast expanse of brown grass and distant blue hills, was erased, buried under a blinding, suffocating whiteness. The wind sculpted the drifts into monstrous waves that crested against the cabin and the barn, sealing them in. Life shrank to the length of the rope Eli tied between the cabin door and the barn entrance, a lifeline he navigated twice a day to feed the livestock. The rest of the time was spent indoors. In the small, dim space of the cabin, Lila healed. Her feet, treated with lard and wrapped in clean rags Eli provided, slowly mended. The raw, blistered skin toughened, and the frost-nipped toes regained their color. She began to move around the cabin with a quiet efficiency, transforming the space from a bachelor's rough shelter into something resembling a home. She took ownership of the hearth, learning the quirks of the stove, baking bread that filled the cabin with a scent Eli had not smelled since his mother passed. She found his mending kit and, with small, precise stitches, repaired the rips and tears in his shirts and his coat. She chopped the vegetables from the root cellar, potatoes, carrots, and onions, her knife striking the wooden cutting board in a steady, rhythmic percussion that became the new sound of his evenings. Eli watched her, saying little. He was a man defined by the absence of others, and her presence was a constant, unsettling pressure. He found himself cataloging the details of her, the way she tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear, the focused set of her jaw as she concentrated on a task, the way her eyes always checked for him when a sudden noise, like a log shifting in the fire, startled her. In the far corner of the cabin sat a broken rocking chair. It had been his mother's, and Eli had not had the heart to burn it for firewood, nor the will to fix it. The back was split, and one of the rockers was splintered. One evening, after Lila had finished washing the tin plates from supper, he saw her look at it, her hand running over the dusty armrest. She had nowhere to sit comfortably. The hard-backed chairs at the table were built for utility, not rest, and the cot was her bed. Eli said nothing, but the next day, he brought the chair closer to the fire. He spent the afternoon carefully sanding down the splintered rocker, mixing pine resin and sawdust to fill the split in the back. He worked with a focused intensity, his large, calloused hands surprisingly delicate. Lila watched him from the table, where she was sorting dried beans. She did not ask what he was doing or for whom. She just watched. When he was finished, the chair was whole again, sturdy and strong. He tested it with his own weight, making it rock gently on the floorboards. Satisfied, he stood and pushed it into the warmest spot by the hearth. He looked at Lila, his expression unreadable. "It will hold," he said, his voice gruff. Lila approached it slowly, as if it were a timid animal. She touched the smooth, newly sanded wood. Then, hesitantly, she sat down. She let out a small, unconscious sigh as she leaned back, the chair rocking her gently. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered, looking at the fire. "No one has ever built me anything." That night, the barrier of silence began to crack. She sat in the rocking chair, mending a pair of his wool socks. He sat opposite, cleaning his rifle, the smell of gun oil sharp in the air. "You said you had a brother," Lila said, her voice soft. "Samuel." Eli's hands stilled. He had not spoken that name aloud in years. He looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "Yes," he said. "Is he? Why are you alone?" Eli methodically reassembled the breech of the Winchester. He should have told her to be quiet. He should have told her it was none of her business. But the words came anyway, pulled from a deep, cold place inside him. "He is dead. 5 years ago. We built this place together." He told her everything. He told her about the land barons who wanted their water. He told her about the false accusations of rustling. He told her about the ambush in the canyon, the bright red stain spreading across Samuel's chest, the feel of his brother's life growing cold in his arms. "I was charged," Eli continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They said I was in on it, that I helped the thieves, said I killed my own brother when the deal went bad. I sat in a cell for 6 months." "But you did not do it," Lila whispered. "It did not matter. When they let me go, the town had already decided. I was a pariah, a killer, a thief. It was easier to just be what they thought I was. Easier to be alone." He finished with the rifle and set it against the wall. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Lila looked down at the sock in her lap. Her hands were trembling. "I know about being what people say you are," she said. She took a shaky breath. "I told you I was 19. I had my birthday last month. In the saloon, Mr. Sterling. He held a party. He charged the men extra to wish me well." Eli's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. "My father left me in Laramie when I was 14. He went to find work in the silver mines and never came back. The debt he owed Sterling, for whiskey and lodging, became mine. Sterling gave me a room, gave me food. He said I would work it off, but the debt only ever grew. She stopped, her needle frozen in the wool. I was never allowed outside the town limits. He told me the sheriff would arrest me for vagrancy if I tried to leave. I was his property. She looked down at her mended feet, now covered by the thick wool socks Eli had given her. I never owned a pair of shoes, she said, her voice barely audible. He only gave us thin slippers for the saloon floor. He said shoes were for women who had somewhere to go. He said I was not going anywhere. Eli said nothing. He stared into the fire, a cold, hard rage settling in his gut. He thought of the bruises he had first seen on her, the raw terror. It was one thing to be hated by a town. It was another to be owned by a monster. The small cabin, once a symbol of his isolation, now felt different. It was not just his shelter. It was hers. It was a fortress. A new awareness grew between them in the following weeks. The proximity, forced by the blizzard, was no longer just a shared space. It became charged. One afternoon, Lila was kneading dough for bread, her sleeves rolled up, a dusting of flour on her cheek. She was humming. It was a low, tuneless sound, a half-remembered melody. Eli, who was stacking firewood by the door, stopped and listened. It was the first sound of simple contentment he had heard in his house, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was the sound of life, of healing. He watched her for a long moment before she noticed him, blushed, and fell silent. Lila, in turn, began to see the man beneath the gruff exterior. She watched him through the window as he moved through the snow to the barn. He was gentle with the livestock. She saw him stroking the neck of his gelding, Buster, his voice a low rumble as he spoke to the animal. She noticed his hands. They were scarred, the knuckles split from cold and hard work, the palms thick with calluses, but they were not the hands she knew. Sterling's hands were soft, pale, and heavy with rings. They were hands that gripped, that struck, that took. Eli's hands were hands that built, that mended, that protected. She found herself watching his hands as he held his coffee cup, as he whittled a piece of wood by the fire, as he rested them on the table. The storm that had trapped them returned with a vengeance, a second wave of ice and wind that screamed for 2 straight days. In the middle of the second night, Eli was jolted awake by a sound from the barn, a high, pained neigh. His pregnant mare, Daisy, was not due for another month. He was out of bed instantly, pulling on his boots and heavy coat. "The mare!" he snapped at Lila, who was sitting up in her cot, clutching the blanket. "Stay inside. Keep the fire hot." He grabbed the lantern and plunged into the white chaos, following the rope line. Lila waited for half an hour, the wind shrieking. She could not stay put. She knew that tone of voice. It was not anger, it was fear. She pulled on the spare coat Eli had given her, a large, worn thing that smelled of him, and his spare boots, then wrapped a scarf over her head and followed his tracks. She found him in the stall. The mare was down, sweating and trembling despite the bitter cold. "I told you to stay," Eli grunted, his arms slick with fluid as he tried to help the laboring animal. "You need help," Lila said, setting the lantern on a hook. "It is a breach," Eli said, his voice strained. "The foal is turned wrong. I have to try and pull it." The scene was raw, bloody, and desperate. Lila, who had seen the worst of humanity, had never seen anything like this, but she did not flinch. "What do I do?" she asked. "Hold her head. Talk to her. Keep her calm, or she will fight me and kill us both." Lila moved to the mare's head, stroking the sweat-drenched neck. "It is all right, girl," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "It is all right. We are here. You are safe." For the next hour, they worked. Eli fought with the foal, his muscles straining, his face a mask of grim determination. Lila kept the mare steady, her voice a constant, soothing murmur, pouring out all the comfort she herself had never received. Finally, with a heavy grunt and a terrible, wet sound, Eli pulled the foal free. It slid onto the straw, a small, slick, unmoving heap. "It is dead," Eli breathed, exhausted, slumping against the stall wall. "No," Lila said. She dropped to her knees in the filthy straw. She grabbed a dry sack, her movements quick and frantic. She cleared the foal's mouth and nostrils, then began to rub the tiny, wet body vigorously, trying to stimulate its lungs. "Come on," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, freezing on her cheeks. "Breathe, please. You have to breathe." Eli watched, too tired to move, sure it was hopeless. Lila rubbed harder. "Live," she commanded, her voice fierce. "Live, damn you." The foal's side gave a sudden, spasmodic shudder. It coughed, spraying fluid. Its legs kicked feebly. Then it let out a thin, reedy whinny and tried to lift its head. Lila gasped, collapsing back. She was crying now, deep, shuddering sobs, but she was smiling. The mare, hearing her foal, grunted and nudged Lila's shoulder. Eli pushed himself off the wall and knelt beside her. He looked at the foal, then at Lila. She was covered in straw and birth fluid, her face streaked with tears and dirt. But in the lantern light, she looked fiercely, breathtakingly alive. She reached out and cradled the foal's head, stroking its wet mane. "It is all right," she wept, kissing its head. "You are all right." She looked up at Eli, her eyes shining. "It is the first new life I ever touched." They walked back to the cabin as the first gray light of dawn broke through the receding storm clouds. They were exhausted, frozen, and splattered with mud, but the air between them was warm. That night, the cabin felt smaller, quieter. They had shared something profound, a fight for life against the cold, and it had bound them in a way words could not. Lila sat in the rocking chair, patching the hole in Eli's heavy coat where it had snagged on a nail. Eli sat on the hearth, staring into the flames. The cold of the night seeped through the walls. She finished her stitching and tied off the thread. "Your coat is mended." "Thank you," he said, his voice low. She shivered, pulling her blanket tighter. "It is so cold tonight." He nodded, not looking at her. Lila hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "Eli?" He turned his head. Would you mind if I sat closer to the fire, on the rug?" "Go ahead," he said. She left the chair and sat on the braided rug, a few feet from him. The draft from the floor was cold. She hugged her knees, shivering. Eli watched her for a long moment. He stood, took the heavy wool blanket from his own bed, and sat back down on the hearth. He did not hand her the blanket. Instead, he sat with his back against the stone and unfolded it, holding one side open. It was an invitation. Lila's breath caught. She looked at his face, but he was staring at the fire, his expression neutral. Slowly, she moved over and sat beside him, her shoulder pressing against his arm. He draped the other half of the blanket over her, cocooning them both in a shared warmth. They sat in silence for a long time. Eli was rigid. He was intensely aware of her proximity, the smell of wood smoke and soap from her hair, the small, warm weight of her body against his. A powerful, primitive desire rose in him, mixed with a violent terror. He was terrified of frightening her, of becoming the thing she feared. He could not, would not, be another man who took... Lila could feel the tension radiating from him, the iron control in his muscles. She realized he was not tense with desire, but with the fear of it. He was afraid of hurting her. This knowledge, that he was actively protecting her from himself, broke the last defense around her heart. Slowly, her hand crept from beneath the blanket. She reached for him. Her small, cold fingers touched his scarred, warm hand, which rested on his knee. He flinched, but did not pull away. "You are shaking?" she whispered. Eli swallowed, his voice tight. "Lila, I will not frighten you." She turned her head to look at him. She slid her fingers between his, lacing their hands together. She held on tight. "You do not frighten me," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You are the first man who has never taken..." Her words stripped him bare. All the years of loneliness, of rage, of cold emptiness, seemed to collapse. He looked at her, truly seeing her, not as a victim, but as the woman who had faced down death in his barn, who had brought life into the world, who was now holding his hand. He leaned in. He did not kiss her mouth. He pressed his lips, gently, reverently, to her forehead. It was a promise, a benediction. Lila's eyes closed. A single tear slid down her cheek. Then another. The dam of her trauma broke. She let out a small, broken sound and turned her face into his chest, clutching the front of his shirt. She did not sob loudly, but wept with the silent, agonizing grief of years. Eli's arms came around her, pulling her close. He held her tightly, one hand moving to the back of her head, stroking her hair. He held her as she wept for her lost childhood, for the pain she had endured, for the simple, profound relief of being safe. The storm worsened again, isolating them completely. The coyotes, driven mad by hunger, grew bold, their howls circling the cabin, their dark shapes slinking past the windows. The food they had stockpiled began to dwindle. Eli started rationing the flour and the salted meat. The world outside was starving. The stress and the confinement wore on Lila. The past was not a distant memory. It was a hungry wolf, pacing just outside the light. One night, Eli was ripped from a shallow sleep by a terrified scream. "No, get off me! Please, Sterling, no!" He was across the room in 2 seconds, rifle in hand. Lila was thrashing on the cot, fighting the blankets, her eyes wide with a nightmare's terror. "Lila!" Eli shouted, grabbing her shoulders. "Wake up! You are safe!" She fought him, her hands striking his chest. "No, let me go! It is Eli! You are here! You are safe!" His voice finally cut through the panic. Her eyes focused on him. The terror receded, replaced by a devastating, hollow look. "Eli?" she whispered, trembling from head to foot, her nightgown soaked in a cold sweat. He was here. He had his cane." "It was a dream," Eli said, his voice rough but gentle. "Just a dream. He is not here. He cannot get to you." He let go of her, but she immediately grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in. "Do not go," she pleaded, her voice a child's. "Please, do not leave me alone in the dark." He looked at her, so small and broken in the cot, and then at the door, where the wind howled. He could not leave her, but he would not dishonor the trust she had given him. He sat on the edge of the cot, his back against the cold log wall. He pulled her against his side, keeping the blankets wrapped tightly around her. "I am right here," he said, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. "I will not let anything happen to you." Lila sagged against him, exhausted by the terror. She cried softly for a few minutes. Then her breathing steadied. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, her head resting on his chest. Eli did not sleep. He sat awake until dawn, the heavy rifle resting against his legs, listening to the coyotes and the wind, a sentinel guarding the fragile, new life that had taken root in his frozen world. The world began to change with the slow, agonizing melt. The snow, which had been a fortress, began to retreat, revealing the brown, muddy earth beneath. The air, while still cold, lost its razor edge. Sounds returned, the drip of water from the eaves, the crack of ice in the creek, the distant call of a hawk. For Eli, this thaw meant the return of the world he had shut out. For Lila, it meant the end of the only safety she had ever known. Eli saw the fear growing in her again, the way her eyes darted to the window, the way she startled at the sound of the wind, mistaking it for riders. He knew she could not live as a prisoner in his cabin forever. "It is time you learned to ride," he announced one morning. Lila looked at him, her eyes wide. "Ride? A horse?" "This is not a town. Lila, out here, you walk, you die, you ride, you have a chance. You need to be able to run if you have to." He took her to the corral. His bay gelding, Buster, was too spirited. Instead, he saddled Daisy, the mare, who was calm and steady after weaning her new foal. Lila approached the animal with profound trepidation, her hands clenched at her sides. "She is so big," Lila whispered. "She will not hurt you," Eli said. He cupped his hands. "Put your left foot here. Grab the saddle horn." She was clumsy. Her skirts tangled. She had no strength in her arms, and she fell back twice. Eli, patient as he was with a green colt, simply set her back on her feet and had her try again. On the third attempt, she scrambled into the saddle, sitting precariously, clutching the horn with white-knuckled hands. "I am going to fall," she said, her voice tight with panic. "You will not fall unless you let go," Eli said, taking the reins. He led the mare around the corral at a slow walk. Lila wobbled, her body rigid, her entire being focused on the terrifying, unfamiliar motion. "Breathe," Eli commanded. "Feel her. Move with her." He walked beside her for an hour, then 2. He showed her how to hold the reins, how to shift her weight. Slowly, the terror in her eyes was replaced by something else. Concentration. By the end of the day, she was walking the mare around the corral by herself. A small, shaky smile touched her lips. "I am doing it, Eli," she said, her voice full of wonder. "You are," he said, leaning against the fence. "I am, in charge of where she goes." Eli nodded. "That is the point. She rode every day. She was awkward. Her balance was poor, but she was fearless. She fell. She got back on. She learned to trot. Her laughter a startled, bright sound that cut through the cold air. Eli watched her, a knot in his chest. He was giving her freedom, and with it, the ability to leave him. The next lesson was the rifle. He set a tin can on a fence post 50 yards away. He handed her his Winchester. The weapon was heavier than she expected. She staggered under its weight. "It will kick," he warned, standing behind her, his hands on her shoulders to steady her stance. "Hold it tight against your shoulder. Do not be afraid of it. You command it." Lila flinched when he was near her, her body instinctively bracing, but his touch was impersonal, the touch of an instructor. It was firm, grounding. She relaxed. "Line up the sight," he said, his voice low by her ear. "Breathe out slowly. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." She shut her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The rifle stock slammed into her shoulder, knocking her backward into Eli's chest. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet to the left of the can. She cried out, dropping the gun, her shoulder throbbing. "I cannot," she said, rubbing the spot. "It hurts." "Everything worthwhile hurts at first," Eli said, picking up the rifle. "Load it again." He made her do it again, and again. She learned to respect the kick, to brace for it. She learned to keep her eyes open, to breathe, to squeeze. On the 10th shot, the tin can jumped off the fence post with a satisfying ping. Lila stared at it. She had done that. She had pointed the heavy, loud, violent thing and made it obey her. A surge of power, raw and unfamiliar, shot through her. It was not the power to harm. It was the power to defend. It was the power to say no. She turned to Eli, her face flushed, her eyes blazing. "I hit it. I saw," he said. A small, rare smile touched the corner of his mouth. Again. They settled into a new routine, one defined by the returning world. Lila's feet had healed, but she still had nothing to wear on them but the thick wool socks. The ground was cold and wet. One night, Eli did not clean his rifle. He sat by the fire with a thick piece of cured deer hide he had taken from his stores, a sharp awl, and a length of sinew. Lila watched him, her hands still in her lap. As he worked, he was not a cobbler. His stitches were rough, his cuts uneven, but he worked with a focused, patient intensity. He took measurements of her feet using a piece of string. He hammered the thick hide to soften it, then painstakingly stitched the pieces together. It took him 3 nights. On the 3rd night, he finished. He held up a pair of simple, high-topped moccasins, sturdy and warm. They were crude, but they were strong. "These will keep your feet dry," he said, handing them to her. Lila took them. They were still warm from his hands. She ran her fingers over the thick, uneven stitching. They were the most beautiful things she had ever seen. "Put them on," he said. She slipped her sock-clad feet into them. They fit perfectly, molding to her feet, the leather warm and protective. She stood and took a step, feeling the solid floor beneath her. "Eli," she whispered, her throat tight. "They are not fancy," he said, turning back to the fire. "Wait." She touched his arm. He looked at her. She pointed to the side of one boot, where he had taken his knife and carved a single, deep letter into the hide. L. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. She touched the letter. It was the first thing she had ever owned that had her name on it. The first time anyone had claimed her as her. She could not speak. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his rough wool shirt, and wept. Eli froze, his body rigid. He was unused to casual touch, let alone a desperate embrace. After a long moment, his hands came up, hesitantly, and rested on her back. He held her, stiff and awkward, as she cried, his heart hammering against his ribs. "They are just boots, Lila," he said, his voice thick. "No," she muffled against his chest. "They are mine." A week later, the snow had receded enough that the southern-facing slopes were clear. The woodpile was running low. "We will ride out and gather firewood," Eli said. "The wagon is useless in this mud, but we can pack some of the horses." He rode Buster, and Lila rode Daisy. She felt a thrill as they left the corral, riding side by side. It was the first time she had left the immediate vicinity of the cabin since the night she arrived. The world felt enormous, the sky a high, aching blue. She felt free. They rode for 2 miles, following the creek bed where fallen cottonwood branches were plentiful. They dismounted and began tying bundles of dry wood, the silence comfortable between them. Eli stopped, his head coming up. He was staring at the muddy bank of the creek. "What is it?" Lila asked. "Stay there." He walked over to the bank. Kneeling, Lila followed, her new boots making sucking sounds in the mud. She saw what he was looking at. Tracks, deep, wide ruts from a heavy wagon, pressed into the mud. They were not Eli's tracks, and they were far from any established road. "Who was this?" Lila asked, her blood running cold. "I do not know," Eli said, his voice grim. He studied the tracks. They were here in the last few days, since the melt. He stood and scanned the high ridges that surrounded his valley. They were not lost. They were following the creek, staying low, out of sight of the cabin, scouting. Lila's breath hitched. "They are looking for me." "They are looking for something," Eli said, his face hardening into the stone mask she had seen when he spoke of his past. "Let us go. The firewood can wait." They rode back in silence. The brief, happy spell of freedom shattered. The fortress had been breached. The world knew they were there. The next few days were tense. Eli was rarely in the cabin. He was riding the boundaries of his property from dawn until dusk, his rifle always in his hand. Lila watched from the window, her stomach in knots. He came in one evening, his face set. "I have to go to town." Lila's heart stopped. "No, Eli, you cannot. They will see you. They will ask questions." "We are out of salt. We are almost out of flour. The coffee is gone. I cannot let us starve. And I need cartridges for the Winchester." He put his hands on her shoulders. "It will be fine. I will be in and out before midday. But you cannot be here." "I will go with you," she said, her voice desperate. "Absolutely not. That is what they are waiting for. You will stay here. You will hide." He pulled back the bearskin rug from the center of the floor, revealing a thick trap door. He lifted it, showing her a small, dark hole. A root cellar dug into the cold earth. It smelled of damp soil and potatoes. Lila recoiled. "No, not in there. It is like a grave." "It is safe," Eli said firmly. "I will be back before nightfall. I will take the key to the padlock. But just in case." He took a heavy iron pry bar and set it inside the cellar. "If I am not back, if someone else comes, you use this to get out the back hatch." He pointed to a small, boarded-over opening on the far side. "It leads under the porch. You run. You take Daisy. You take the rifle, and you ride north into the hills. Do not stop." The fear in her stomach turned to ice. He was preparing for her to run. He was preparing to die. "Eli, this is not a request. Lila, this is how we survive. Get in." She climbed down, her boots touching the damp earth. He handed her a lantern, a jug of water, and a blanket. She looked up at him, her face pale in the light. "Be safe," she whispered. "I will," he said. "Do not make a sound. No matter what you hear." He closed the heavy door, plunging her into darkness. She heard the scrape of the heavy padlock being fastened above her. She was alone, buried. The ride to Laramie was 20 miles of nerve-wracking tension. Eli kept to the ridges, avoiding the main road, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He saw no one. The town was a sea of mud. He tied Buster outside the general store, his eyes sweeping the street. He saw a few familiar, unfriendly faces. He ignored them. Inside, the store was warm, smelling of kerosene, tobacco, and coffee beans. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, nodded curtly. "Turner, been a while." "Been winter," Eli said, handing him a list. "I need flour, salt, coffee, and a box of 4570 cartridges." As Henderson gathered the goods, two men who had been lingering by the stove turned. Eli did not recognize them. They were rough, wearing town clothes but with revolvers strapped high and prominent. "Buying ammunition, friend?" the larger one asked. Eli ignored him. "I said, are you buying ammunition?" the man repeated, stepping closer. "I am," Eli said, not looking at him. "Man needs ammunition. He is either hunting or he is expecting trouble." "Which one is it?" "Both," Eli said. Henderson returned, sliding the heavy box of cartridges onto the counter. The man's eyes fixed on it. "That is a heavy load." The second, smaller man said, "Good for bears, or men." "Heard there is a $50 reward out," the first man said, leaning against the counter. "From Sterling, over at the Spur. Seems he lost something. A girl. Dark hair, pretty. You live out on the grasslands, don't you? Awfully lonely out there. Have you seen any strangers? Seen a girl like that?" Eli's blood ran cold. He met the man's gaze, his eyes flat and dead. I live alone," Eli said. "I do not see anyone, and I do not like people asking questions." The man smiled, a cold, thin expression. "Just asking. $50 is a lot of money for a lost item. Here's your supplies." "Eli?" Henderson said, pushing the sacks toward him. Eli paid in coin, his movements deliberate. He hefted the sacks, nodding to Henderson. He walked past the two men, every muscle in his back screaming. He expected a hand on his shoulder, a shot. Nothing happened. He loaded the supplies onto Buster and mounted them. He did not look back. He rode out of town at a steady walk, not wanting to spook them by running. He did not spur Buster into a gallop until he was 2 miles out of sight, in the cover of the hills. He found Lila huddled in the cellar. The lantern burned low, her face white with fear. When she heard his voice, she nearly collapsed in relief. He pulled her out, his arms strong and sure. She clung to him for a long moment, breathing in the cold, clean scent of him. "They were there," he said, his voice flat. "In the store, asking about you, offering a reward." Lila sagged against him. "I knew it. I knew he would not stop." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a desperate, new resolve. "He will send them. He will send them to get me, and they will kill you for hiding me." "Let them come," Eli growled, his hand tightening on her arm. That night, the cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a target. The imminent danger was a living thing in the room, a third presence that sat with them by the fire. Eli was cleaning his rifle, his movements sharp, angry. Lila sat in the rocking chair, her hands clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. She could not be still. She stood. She walked to him, where he knelt by the fire. He looked up, surprised by her sudden movement. She knelt in front of him, on the rug. "Lila, what is it?" She reached out and took the oil rag from his hand. His fingers were stiff. Eli, she said, her voice shaking, but not from the cold. I am so scared, but I am not scared of you. He watched her, his expression wary. What are you talking about? In Laramie, she whispered, her eyes fixed on him. At the spur, men, they paid sterling, and he would let them use me. They would touch me, but it was not me. It was just a body, a thing he was selling. Eli's face contorted, a mixture of rage and pain. Lila, stop. You do not have to talk about that. He tried to stand, to get away from the rawness of her confession, but she placed her hands on his knees, holding him. Yes, I do, she said. I need to. All this time, I have been a thing, a ghost. But with you, I feel real. That foe, the boots, the rifle, I am real. She leaned closer, her breath catching. I want to know what it is like. Eli, I want to know what it is like to be with a man. With you, I want you to touch me. Her voice broke on the last words. I want to be touched, like it is real. Eli stared at her, his heart hammering so hard he thought it would break his ribs. He saw no fear in her eyes. He saw terror. Yes, but it was terror of her own request, not of him, and beneath it, a desperate, profound need. It was not the hollow lust of the saloon. It was a hunger for her own humanity. He cupped her face, his calloused thumbs stroking her cheeks. Lila, he breathed. Are you sure? You do not owe me anything. I know, she said. This is not payment. This is for me. This is my choice. He leaned in, his movements achingly slow, giving her every second to retreat. He saw her eyes flutter shut as his lips brushed hers. It was the first kiss of her life. It was not a kiss of passion, but of hesitant discovery. It was soft, chaste, tasting of wood smoke and the salt of her tears. She let out a small, broken sound into his mouth, and her hands came up to grip his shirt. The kiss deepened, and something that had been frozen inside Eli for 5 years shattered. He slid his hands into her hair, tilting her head, and kissed her with a slow, rising warmth that came from his very soul. She gasped, not in fear, but in surprise. He lifted her easily, pulling her onto his lap as he sat back on his heels. She was so small, so light. His hands, the hands that mended and built, trembled as they moved over her back, her arms. Go slow, she whispered against his mouth, a desperate plea. Please, Eli, go slow. I will, he promised, his voice thick. He stood, carrying her, and walked a few steps to her cot. He laid her down, the firelight painting her face in shades of orange and red. He did not take his eyes from hers as he began to unbutton his shirt. The moments that followed were slow, tender, and almost unbearably emotional. For Eli, it was a reawakening, a painful return of feelings he had buried with his brother. For Lila, it was a reclamation. Every touch was a question. Every soft gasp she gave was an answer. He was terrified of hurting her, of making a wrong move, of reminding her of Sterling's cane, but she guided him, her small hands pulling him closer. It is all right, she whispered, sensing his fear. It is you. As he finally covered her, sheltering her with his own body, she clung to him, her nails grazing his shoulders. This was not the passive, numb endurance of her past. This was an active, desperate embrace, in the dim light of the dying fire, as he made her his. She looked at him, her eyes clear and present. Mine, she whispered, the word, a brand on his heart. You are mine. He was overwhelmed. He was undone. The depth of her need was not for lust, but for a love that did not hurt, for a connection that affirmed she was alive, and in healing her, he felt the frozen splinters of his own heart begin to thaw. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blankets, the cabin silent. Outside, the world was dark. Then, a new, gentle snow began to fall, tiny flakes drifting past the window, muffling the world, hiding them just a little longer. Eli held her, his arm wrapped tightly around her, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder. He felt her breathing, deep and even. She was asleep, truly asleep, without fear. For the first time, he stared into the darkness, a terrible, fierce love rising in him. The men would come. The reward was too high. Sterling would not forget. But Eli knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones, that this fight was no longer about his solitude. He held her closer. "You can stay here as long as you want, Lila," he whispered to the sleeping woman. "This is your home now." The thaw came not as a gentle promise, but as a violent cracking. Ice dams on the creek broke with sounds like distant gunfire, sending muddy, churning water over the low banks. The snow, which had been a clean white blanket, rotted from the ground up, revealing a winter's worth of matted grass and the deep, hungry mud beneath. The sky, once a low, oppressive gray, stretched high and blue, full of restless wind. With the melt, the roads cleared. The world was passable again. Inside the cabin, the change in season brought a new, fragile tension. The intimacy they had shared, born in the dark and the cold, now had to survive the harsh light of day. They were awkward, shy. Eli would find his gaze lingering on the curve of her neck as she stirred the breakfast pot, and she would blush, her hands fumbling with the spoon. He was rougher in his movements, as if his own body had betrayed his solitude, and he was wary of this new, tender thing that lived between them. The silence, once a shared comfort, was now filled with the unspoken. What happens now? The answer came on a bright, cold afternoon in late April. Eli was splitting logs by the side of the cabin, the thwack of the axe a sharp report in the clear air. Lila was inside, airing out the heavy blankets. She was by the open window when she saw the rider. He was a mile off, moving at a steady, unhurried pace, following the creek bed just as the wagon tracks had. "Eli," she said, her voice sharp, all the new softness gone, replaced by the old, brittle fear. He did not look up, but his swing stopped. "Inside, now!" "Eli, he is coming right for the cabin. Get inside, Lila, and get the Winchester. Do not show yourself at the window, but be ready." He dropped the axe and wiped his hands on his trousers. He moved to the porch, picking up the double-barreled shotgun he kept leaned by the door. He broke it open, checked the shells, and snapped it shut with a definitive, oily click. He stood on the porch, waiting, a solid, unmovable object. The rider approached. He was not a cowboy. He wore a dark duster, stained and worn, and a flat-brimmed hat. He stopped his horse 20 yards from the porch, a polite distance. He had a thin face, a narrow mustache, and pale, watchful eyes. "Afternoon," the man called out, his voice unnervingly pleasant. He did not raise his hands, nor did he rest them near his gun. He simply kept them on the saddle horn. Eli said nothing. He just held the shotgun, its barrels pointed at the ground, but ready. "Looking for some strays," the man said, his smile not touching his eyes. "Cattle. Went missing from my boss's lease up north. Thought they might have drifted down here to the creek for water. You the owner here, Turner?" "This is my land," Eli said, his voice a low rumble. "There are no strays here, only my stock. Mind if I look around?" the man asked, still smiling. "My boss. He is awfully particular about his property, likes to have it all accounted for." "I mind," Eli said. "You are not welcome here. The road is back the way you came." The man's smile tightened by a fraction. "Just doing my job. Friend, no need to be unfriendly." Inside the cabin, Lila peeked through a crack in the log wall. The light hit the man's face. She saw the thin scar that ran from the corner of his mustache to his ear. Her blood turned to ice. She knew that scar. She knew that voice. It was Silas, Sterling's man, the one who collected debts, the one who found girls who tried to run, the one who brought them back to be made an example of. She gripped the Winchester, her knuckles white. Silas seemed to sense he was being watched. His gaze flicked to the cabin window, his pale eyes narrowing. He looked back at Eli. "Folks in town said you were a man who likes to be left alone," Silas said, his voice losing its friendly veneer. But folks are saying all sorts of things lately. Saying a man might find more than just cattle out here, might find other lost property. Eli raised the shotgun, the barrels coming up to point directly at the man's chest. I said, "You are not welcome," Eli said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Get off my land, now!" Silas's eyes locked on the twin barrels of the shotgun. He held his hands up, open and away from his gun. "Easy, friend, easy. Just asking. No harm in asking." He slowly reined his horse around, the animal sensing the tension and sidestepping nervously. "You have a good day." "Turner," Silas called over his shoulder. He did not look back. He rode away at the same unhurried pace, disappearing back into the fold of the hills. Eli stood on the porch for a full 5 minutes, the shotgun steady, until the man was long gone. He finally lowered the weapon, his shoulders tight with a rage so cold it burned. Lila stumbled out of the cabin, her face the color of ash. She was shaking so hard she had to grip the door frame. "That was him," she whispered. "That was Silas. He works for Sterling. He finds us." Eli turned to her, his face a grim mask. "I know." He walked past her into the cabin. He set the shotgun down and immediately went to his ammunition box. He began counting cartridges. "He will be back," Lila said, following him. "Eli, you do not understand. He will not come back alone. He will bring men. They will burn this place down. They will kill you." "Let them," Eli said, lining up brass shells on the table. "No," she cried, grabbing his arm. "You cannot fight them. This is my fault. This is because of me. We have to run. We can take the horses. We can ride north. You said we could ride into the hills." Eli stopped counting and looked at her. His hand covered hers, his calloused fingers gripping her tightly. "I am done running," he said, his voice raw. "I let them run me off once. I let them take my brother. I let them call me a thief and a killer. I am not running again. This is my land, and you are mine." "But I am not worth your life," she wept, tears of terror and guilt streaming down her face. "You do not know what Sterling is? He is a monster. He will never stop." "Then I will stop him." "You cannot," she insisted, her voice rising to a hysterical shriek. "You think he is just a saloon owner? He owns half that town. He owns the sheriff. He buys men like Silas by the dozen. He... She pulled away from him, backing up until she hit the wall, her hands twisting in her dress. "You do not know what I did." Eli watched her, his expression wary. "What did you do, Lila?" "The night I ran," she whispered, her eyes wide and haunted. "It was not... I did not just run. He was going to sell me to a trader from the East, a man who liked his women. Young, Sterling was so pleased. He said I was finally earning my keep. He said I would be gone in the morning." She was shaking, reliving it. "I went to the kitchen. I took the big butcher knife. I went to his room. Eli, he was asleep. He was drunk. He was snoring. I stood over him, with the knife. I held it up. I could feel the heat coming off him." Eli's face was unreadable. "I thought about my whole life," she choked out. "I thought about my father leaving me. I thought about all the men. I thought about the cane. I thought about never seeing the sun. And I tried. I really tried." Her face crumpled, and she slid down the wall to the floor, hiding her face in her knees. "But I could not do it. I dropped the knife. It made such a noise. It woke him up. I ran. I just ran. I ran out the back door, into the alley, and I did not stop. I ran until I could not feel my feet. I ran until I found your barn." She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "I am a coward. Eli, I could not even kill him to save myself, and now I have brought him here, to you." Eli stood there for a long time, the brass cartridges forgotten on the table. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her. He did not touch her. "You are not a coward," he said, his voice rough. "You are not a killer. That is why you ran. That is why you are here." He reached out, his finger tracing the tear track on her cheek. "I am not angry that you tried. I am angry that you had to..." The strain of the encounter and the confession settled over them like a shroud. The fragile intimacy they had built was overshadowed by the looming, physical threat. They moved around each other like ghosts, the cabin suddenly too small, filled with unspoken fear. Eli was all business, checking the hinges on the doors, nailing a heavy board over the small back window. Lila watched him, her heart breaking with every hammer blow. He was turning their home into a tomb. She saw him through the window, practicing with the rifle, firing at the tin can. He was fast, accurate, but he was one man. Silas would bring 5 or 10. The guilt was a living thing inside her, a poison. He was going to die. This good, quiet, broken man who had mended her feet, who had taught her to ride, who had touched her like she was real. He was going to die because she was a coward. She could not let that happen. That night, she waited. Eli did not come to her cot. He did not touch her. He sat in his chair by the fire, the shotgun across his lap, watching the door. He was already on guard. He fell into a light, restless sleep around 2 in the morning, his head lolling against the chair back. Lila slid from her cot. Her movements were silent, practiced from years of moving through the saloon without drawing attention. She put on her dress, her wool socks, and the precious boots he had made for her. She grabbed the spare coat. She looked at the table, a piece of jerky, a hunk of bread. She took them. She looked at him one last time. His hard, scarred face softened in sleep by the firelight. "I am sorry," she thought. "I am so sorry. But you will live." She eased the door latch back. It was heavy, but well-oiled. She opened it an inch, a sliver of cold night air cutting into the room. "Where do you think you are going?" His voice, low and cold, came from the darkness by the fire. He had not been asleep. Lila froze, her hand on the latch. She turned. He was standing, the shotgun still in his hand, his eyes black pits in the dim light. "I am leaving," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I am going. They are looking for me. If I am not here, they will have no reason to come. They will leave you alone." He took a step toward her. "You think it is that simple? You will just walk out into the night? Where will you go? Lila, back to Sterling? Or will you just freeze in a ditch?" "It does not matter," she said, pulling the door open wider. "It matters that you are safe. I will not be the reason you die. I will not have your blood on my hands. 2. You think this is your choice to make?" he said, his voice rising, the cold calm breaking. He crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed her arm, spinning her around, away from the door. He slammed it shut, the sound echoing the finality of a gunshot. "Let me go, Eli," she cried, struggling against his grip. "No," he growled, his fingers digging into her arm. "You do not get to do this. You do not get to decide that I am better off. You do not get to walk out just because it is hard to be loved." "This is not about love," she screamed, hitting his chest with her free hand. "This is about living. I bring death. I brought it to my parents, and I am bringing it to you." "You brought life to this house," he roared, shaking her. "It was dead before you got here. I was dead. And you think I'm just going to let you walk away?" "You have to," she sobbed, collapsing against him, her fight gone. "Please, Eli, I am poisoned. Let me go." He held her, his grip still tight, his whole body trembling with a violent, possessive rage. It was the rage of a man who had lost everything and found one thing worth keeping. "No," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him. "I will not." He kissed her. It was not the slow, tender kiss of their first night. It was a brutal, desperate claim. It was a kiss of anger, of fear, of profound, animal need. It was a kiss that said, "You are not leaving." She fought him for a second, her hands pushing against his shoulders. But his mouth was insistent, demanding. He kicked the door shut and lifted her, his arms steel bands around her, and carried her back into the room. He did not take her to the cot. He fell with her onto the thick bearskin rug in front of the dying fire, his body covering hers, trapping her. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. But the shock was not fear. It was recognition. This was not the cold violence of Sterling. This was the hot, desperate passion of a man terrified of loss. "Do not leave me," he breathed against her mouth, his voice breaking. "Do not you ever leave me." The argument collapsed. The fear turned into something else. The raw, clashing needs of two broken people ignited. She stopped pushing him away and wrapped her legs around him, pulling him closer. Her hands tore at his shirt, needing to feel his skin to anchor him. Their lovemaking was not slow. It was intense, heated, and raw. It was a clash of wills, a desperate, breathless fight to erase the outside world. It was a storm inside the cabin that matched the one they knew was coming. It was every ounce of fear, guilt, and 5 years of Eli's solitude channeled into a single, violent act of possession, of belonging. And when it was over, they lay gasping, tangled on the floor, the firelight casting flickering shadows over their damp skin. They did not speak for a long time. The argument was over. The decision was made. She was not leaving. He was not letting her go. The next day, the tension was gone. In its place was a quiet, grim resolve. Eli went out in the morning. He returned with a large, perfectly seasoned log of aspen. He sat by the fire, next to the rocking chair he had fixed for her. He took out his carving knife. Lila watched him from the table. He began to work. He was not repairing anything. He was carving, his hands sure and steady, shaping the wood. He was making a chair, a simple, sturdy chair, made of the same wood as the cabin, but with a straight, strong back, a mate to her rocker. He worked all day. As dusk settled, he set the final piece. He stood, testing it. It was solid. He placed it on the hearth, directly beside her rocking chair. A pair. Lila walked over, her hand tracing the smooth, newly carved wood. "Now it is ours," Eli said, his voice quiet. He was not just talking about the chair. He meant the hearth, the home, the fight. She looked at him, her eyes clear. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard strength she had learned from him. "All right," she said. Eli nodded. He walked to the wall and picked up the Winchester. He checked the action. His movements economical. "We need a plan. They will come from the south, following the creek. It is the only cover." Lila turned and picked up the second rifle. The older one, Eli kept as a spare. She held it, feeling its weight. "Show me how to load it faster," she said. The decision was not a compromise. It was a declaration. They would not wait for the wolves to come to the door. Eli would ride out to meet them. "You are going to town?" Lila asked, her voice tight with disbelief as she watched him saddle Buster. The morning was clear, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. "I am," Eli said. He did not look at her. He was checking the cinch, his movements economical and precise. "I'm going to see the sheriff." "Eli, no," she pleaded, following him as he led the horse from the corral. "That is what they want. Silas will be there. They will be waiting for you. It is a trap." "It is not a trap if you walk in with your eyes open," he said. He turned to her, his face set in hard lines. "I am tired of hiding. Lila, I have lived by their rules for 5 years. I let them call me a killer. I let them push me out here. I am not letting them decide what happens in my own home. I am going to demand protection for you." "Demand?" she said, a bitter laugh escaping her. "You cannot demand anything from those men. The law in Laramie belongs to Sterling. You will be walking into his house. Then I will be a guest they did not invite." He mounted the horse in one fluid motion. He looked down at her, his gaze softening for just a second. "Board the door after I am gone. Keep the rifle close. Do not open it for anyone but me." "Eli, please." But he had already turned Buster's head, and with a touch of his heels, he was off, riding east, a solitary, determined figure moving against the vast, empty landscape. Lila watched him until he was a small dot on the horizon. She felt a cold, terrible premonition, a hollowness in her chest. He was riding into the fire for her, and she was certain she would never see him again. The ride to Laramie was a gauntlet of memory and resolve. 5 years ago, Eli had been dragged this way in chains. Now, he rode with his head high, the Winchester in its scabbard, his hand resting on his thigh, near the revolver he rarely wore. The town looked the same as he rode down the muddy main street, the same false-fronted buildings, the same wary eyes peering from behind curtains, but he was different. He was no longer the hermit of the grasslands. He was a man with something to lose. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, a small, clapboard building with a sagging porch. He did not tie Buster. He wrapped the reins once around the hitching rail, a clear sign he did not intend to stay long. He walked inside. The office was small, smelling of stale coffee, tobacco, and the iron bar scent of the 2 empty cells in the back. A portly man with a gray, drooping mustache sat behind a cluttered desk, his badge pinned crookedly to a stained vest. This was Sheriff Brody. Brody looked up, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in suspicion. "Turner, I'll be damned. What brings you out of your hole? Finally decided to turn yourself in for that mess 5 years ago?" "You know the charges were dropped, Brody," Eli said, his voice a low, even rumble. He stopped in front of the desk. He did not remove his hat. "Dropped ain't the same as innocent," the sheriff grunted, leaning back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "What do you want?" "I am here to report a crime, or one that is about to be," Eli said. "There is a woman at my ranch, Lila. She is under my protection. Men have been to my property, bounty hunters, threatening her. I want them arrested." Brody stared at him for a long second. Then he slowly reached for a cigar, bit the end off, and spat it onto the floor. "A woman? You do not say a woman named Lila?" "That is what I said." "Dark hair, young, used to work over at the Golden Spur?" Brody said, striking a match and lighting the cigar. He puffed, surrounding himself in a cloud of blue smoke. "She is a free citizen being hunted," Eli said, his voice hardening. The cold fury was beginning to rise. "That is where you are wrong. Turner," Brody said, his voice mockingly patient. "She is not a free citizen. She is property. She is an indentured servant, and she ran out on her contract, Mr. Sterling. Well, he is a man who values his investments. He has put up a reward. Those men you call bounty hunters. They are just agents, retrieving what is his. She was a slave. He bought her. He beat her," Eli said, his hand clenching at his side. "Those are ugly words," Brody said, shaking his head. "All I know is, I have a signed paper here saying she owes Mr. Sterling 3 more years of service. It is all legal. Now, I see this one of 2 ways. 1, you are harboring a fugitive, which is a crime. Or 2, you are a concerned citizen who has found a lost item and is looking to return it. She is not an item, and she is not going back," the sheriff sighed, exasperated. "Turner, why are you doing this? You have no friends in this town. You have a bad memory. People here, they do not like you. You start this. You bring trouble that does not need to be brought. You give me the girl, I hand her back to Sterling, and you ride back to your ranch. Everyone goes on with their lives. Sterling might even forget to press charges against you. So you will not protect her," Eli stated. It was not a question. "I am upholding the law," Brody said, his hand gesturing to the paper on his desk. "The law says she belongs to him. Now, I am telling you as the sheriff of this county, you turn her over, or you will be arrested for theft, and she will be taken by force. Is that clear enough for you?" Eli looked at the man, at the cheap badge, at the column of cigar smoke rising to the ceiling. He saw the entire rotten structure of the town, all held up by Sterling's money. He was alone. "Perfectly," Eli said. He turned, his boots heavy on the floorboards, and walked out. He stood on the porch, his eyes adjusting to the bright, cold light. He saw them then. 2 men, the same 2 from the general store. Silas's men. They were leaning against the building opposite, whittling. They had been waiting. They watched him, their expressions flat, but their eyes triumphant. They had heard it all. The sheriff had made his position clear for the whole town to hear. Eli walked to his horse. He needed supplies. He needed ammunition. He untied Buster and led him down the street to Henderson's general store. When he walked in, the usual low chatter stopped. Mr. Henderson, who had sold him flour and salt just days ago, was behind the counter. His face was cold. "I need cartridges." "Henderson," Eli said. "45.70. "Can't help you," Henderson said, not meeting his eye. He was busy wiping down a counter that was already clean. "You had a dozen boxes last week." "I am." "Out of stock," Henderson said. "And flour? Salt?" "Out of that, too. Seems I'm fresh out of everything you might need." Turner, a man at the back of the store, another rancher named Pike, spoke up. "Heard you are harboring Sterling's runaway whore." "Turner, is that true?" Eli turned. "I am harboring a woman." "It is the same thing," Pike spat. "We have enough trouble out here with cattle prices and the railroad without you bringing Sterling's hired guns down on us. Whatever fight you are picking, we do not want no part of it. Take your trouble and get out of Laramie." Eli looked at the faces in the store. Men he had known. Men he had ridden with before Samuel's death. They were all looking at him with the same old, cold suspicion. The killer, the thief, the outcast. Nothing had changed. They had just found a new reason to hate him. "I see," Eli said quietly. He turned and walked out of the store, empty-handed. He mounted Buster and rode out of town, the silent, accusing stares of the entire population on his back. When Lila saw him riding back, hours earlier than she expected, and with no saddlebags full of supplies, her heart sank. She unbarred the door as he dismounted. One look at his face told her everything. It was a mask of cold, controlled fury. "It is as you said," he said, walking past her into the cabin. "The sheriff works for him. The town is against us. Henderson would not even sell me cartridges." Lila sagged against the door frame. The last frail bit of hope she had been nursing died. "Eli," she said, her voice shaking. She walked to him, taking his hands. They were cold. "It is over. I told you, I am poisoned. I have poisoned you too. This town. They will let Sterling kill you." She sank to her knees, gripping his hands, pressing her cheek against his knuckles. "Please, let me go. I will turn myself in." "I will walk to town. I will tell them you forced me to stay. I will tell them it was not your fault. They will believe me. You will be safe." Eli stood rigid, looking down at the top of her head. He let her speak, let her pour out her guilt. When she was finished, there was a long, terrible silence. Then, he reached down and pulled her to her feet. He gripped her shoulders, his fingers biting into her flesh, not in anger, but in a desperate, unyielding possession. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and fierce. "We are done talking about you leaving. We are done running. This is our home. The law has failed. The town has failed. We have no one but us, and that is going to be enough. We stand here." His certainty was terrifying. It was absolute. "But, Eli, your neighbors, they hate you again. Because of me. They hated me before you," he said. "They just needed a reason to remember it. Now, we work, they will come, and we will be ready." The cabin, their home, became a fortress. The grim resolve that had settled over them after Silas's first visit returned, but now it was sharp, honed by the certainty of the coming fight. "They will come from the south," Eli said, walking the perimeter of the room. "Along the creek. It is the only cover." "How many?" Lila asked, her voice hollow. "Silas, the two from town. Maybe Sterling hired more. I'm guessing 5, maybe 6. They will want to overwhelm us." He handed her Samuel's old rifle. It was lighter than the Winchester, more suited to her. "You remember how to use this?" She nodded, taking the weapon. It felt heavy, cold, and final. "We cannot let them get close enough to use the torches," Eli said. "Fire is what I fear, not their guns." They worked together. They brought the last 2 buckets of water from the well inside. They stacked the heavy table and chairs against the one window that faced west. Eli nailed heavy boards over the small back window, leaving only a narrow slit to shoot through. He did an inventory of his ammunition. He had 2 full boxes of Winchester cartridges, 100 rounds. He had a box and a half for Samuel's rifle, maybe 70 rounds, and 12 shells for the shotgun. It would have to be enough. As night fell, he took a rope from the barn and a small string of brass bells from an old harness. He tied the rope low to the ground, stringing it between the corral fence and the water trough, the most likely path of approach. "It is not much," he said, coming back inside, "but we will hear them before we see them." They did not sleep. They sat in the 2 chairs by the cold hearth, the rifles across their laps. They did not talk. Every sound, the settling of the house, the hoot of an owl, the cry of a distant coyote, made them jump. The attack came just before dawn, in the gray, misty light that turns the world into shadows. It was not the sound of the bells that woke them. It was the horses, a soft nicker from the corral. Eli was on his feet in an instant, moving to the south-facing window. Lila scrambled to the small slit on the west. "I see them," Eli whispered. They were dismounted, moving like ghosts through the mist. 5 men fanned out, moving toward the cabin. Silas was in the center. "They are trying to be quiet," Eli breathed. "They think we are asleep." Lila's heart was hammering so hard she thought it would burst. Her hands, slick with sweat, could barely hold the rifle. "Remember," Eli said, his voice calm, cutting through her panic, "aim for the center of what you see. Squeeze. Do not think. Just squeeze." A dark shape detached itself from the group, running low toward the barn. Eli slowly raised the Winchester, its long barrel resting on the windowsill. "Now," he whispered. He fired. The explosion of the rifle shattered the morning silence. It was deafening in the small cabin. Outside, the man screamed, not in pain, but in surprise, and dove behind the water trough. "Turner!" Silas's voice roared through the mist. "You are a fool! Send out the girl and we will let you live!" A bullet slammed into the log wall beside Eli's head, sending splinters stinging his cheek. The fight had begun. "Lila! West window, now!" Eli yelled, levering another round into the chamber. 2 men were breaking for the west side. Lila shoved the barrel of her rifle through the slit. She saw a man running. She aimed, squeezed her eyes shut, and fired. The recoil slammed her shoulder, but she heard the man yell, "She is in there! She is armed!" Gunfire erupted from all sides. Bullets thudded into the log walls. A terrifying, percussive drumming. The front window exploded in a shower of glass. Eli ducked, firing back into the muzzle flashes he saw in the mist. "Keep their heads down! Lila!" he shouted over the din. "Do not let them get close!" Lila reloaded, her hands shaking so badly she dropped the cartridge. She fumbled for it, sobbing in frustration, then jammed it into the rifle. She fired again. She was not aiming. She was just making noise, just fighting. Eli was calm. He was methodical. Breathe, aim, squeeze. He was a man defending his home, and he was filled with a cold, righteous fury. He saw one of the men, the one from the store, rise up from behind a low rise. Eli fired. The man grunted and clutched his arm. Falling back, "One is hit," Eli yelled, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "I am coming! Eli!" Silas roared. He was running directly at the front door, a heavy axe in his hand. He was counting on Eli being pinned down. "Lila! The door!" Eli swung the Winchester toward the door, but the 2 men on the west side opened up, a hail of bullets keeping him low. Lila saw Silas. He was 20 yards away, a large, dark shape running at them. He was going to break down the door and kill them. The terror of her past, of Sterling, of the cane, of the helplessness, was replaced by a white-hot rage. This man would not take this home from her. He would not take Eli. She left her window, ran to the center of the room, and raised her rifle. She did not aim. She just pointed at the door and fired. The bullet ripped through the heavy pine, splintering it. Silas grunted and stopped, looking at the new hole in the door in surprise. That was the moment. The man at the water trough, seeing Eli pinned and Silas at the door, rose up to get a clear shot. He aimed carefully at the front window. Eli saw him. He swung the Winchester, firing from the hip, a desperate, fast shot. The man fired at the same time. Eli's shot went wide. The man's shot did not. Lila saw it happen. Eli's body was slammed backward, as if hit by a giant, invisible fist. He spun, a dark stain blossoming high on his left shoulder, and collapsed to the floor. The Winchester clattered beside him. Eli! Lila screamed. Silence. The gunfire stopped. "He is down!" one of the men shouted from outside. "I got him! He is down!" Lila stared at Eli. He was unmoving, his face pale, his eyes closed. Blood was already pooling on the floorboards. He is dead. The thought was a cold spike in her brain. They killed him. "Come on," Silas yelled, recovering. "He is dead. Let's get the girl. Burn it." Lila looked at the door. Then she looked at Eli. Then she looked at the rifle in her hands. The terror was gone. The grief was gone. All that was left was a vast, empty coldness. She walked to the shattered front window. She saw Silas, 10 yards away, starting to run toward them again. She raised the rifle. She did not close her eyes. She breathed out, just as Eli had taught her. She saw the center of his chest. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet hit Silas square, throwing him backward. He landed on his back and did not move. The other men stopped, stunned. They stared at their leader, dead in the dirt. Lila levered another round into the chamber. She was not crying. She was not shaking. She was a statue carved from ice. One of the men, the one Eli had wounded in the arm, looked at his dead boss, then at the smoking rifle in the window. He looked at his other companion. "It ain't worth it," he shouted. "It ain't worth $50. He is dead, and she is crazy." He turned and ran for his horse. The other man, after a second's hesitation, followed him. The man Eli had shot behind the trough was already mounted, riding away as fast as he could. In 30 seconds, they were gone. Silence fell, absolute and heavy. The cabin smelled of sulfur, dust, and the coppery tang of fresh blood. Lila did not move for a full minute. She just stood, the rifle smoking. Then she let it drop. "Eli?" she whispered. She ran to him, falling to her knees in the pool of his blood. "Eli, no, no, please." She touched his face. He was so cold. "Eli." "Wake up, please, wake up," he groaned. A low, agonizing sound. His eyes flickered open, fogged with pain. "Lila, I am here," she sobbed, relief washing over her, so profound it made her weak. "Oh, God, Eli, I am here. You are alive." "Did we get them?" he gasped. "They are gone," she said, ripping his shirt open. "They are gone. You are safe." The wound was a nightmare. The bullet had gone clean through, shattering the bone, tearing muscle. It was bleeding, a dark, pulsing flow that would not stop. "The fire," he grunted, his eyes closing again. "Get the knife, the fire." She knew what he meant. Caught her eyes. She scrambled to the hearth, her hands shaking so badly she could barely strike a match. She built the fire, her mind numb. She took his skinning knife and thrust it into the flames until the blade glowed red. He was unconscious when she returned. "I am sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I am so sorry, my love." She pressed the glowing metal into the wound. Eli screamed, a raw, inhuman sound, his back arching off the floor. And then he was blessedly silent, passed out from the agony. The bleeding stopped. She bandaged him. Using every clean rag she had, she dragged him onto her own cot, covering him with blankets. He was pale as death, his breathing shallow. A fever set in almost immediately. For 3 days, she did not sleep. She sat by his side, bathing his face, forcing water between his cracked lips. He was delirious, muttering about Samuel, about cattle, about the cold. He was dying. She could feel him slipping away. On the second night, she was sure he was gone. His breathing was so shallow, his skin so cold. She took his hand, the one that was not splattered with his own blood, and held it to her cheek. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness of the cabin. the confession torn from her soul. "Do not leave me. Eli, please do not leave me alone. I love you. You are my home." She wept, holding his limp hand, waiting for the end. But the end did not come. The fever broke on the third morning. He woke, his eyes clear, though clouded with pain. "Lila?" he whispered. "I am here," she said, tears of exhaustion and joy running down her face. "I am here. You are back." "You stayed," he murmured, his fingers weakly gripping hers. "I will always stay," she said. That afternoon, they heard horses. Lila grabbed the rifle, her heart stopping, but Eli put a hand on her arm. "It is too many. Not a raid," he managed to say. Lila looked out the shattered window. It was Sheriff Brody, and with him were 4 other men, not bounty hunters. They were ranchers. She recognized Jedediah Stone, an old man who owned the ranch to the north. Brody dismounted, his face grim. He walked to the cabin, his hand on his gun. He stopped at the door, looking at the splintered wood, at the dark, dried bloodstain in the yard where Silas lay. They had not had the strength to move him. "Turner," Brody called. "Are you there?" "I am here," Eli called back, his voice weak. Brody came in, his eyes wide, taking in the scene, the shattered furniture, the blood-soaked floor. Eli pale as a sheet on the cot. Lila with a rifle in her hands, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears. "My God," Brody muttered. "What happened here?" "They came," Lila said, her voice cold. 5 of them. Silas. They came to kill us. Now one of them is dead. Are you here to arrest me for it?" Before Brody could answer, Jedediah Stone pushed past him. The old rancher looked at Eli, then at Lila, then at the dead man outside. "Sheriff," Jedediah said, his voice shaking with an old man's emotion. I come because this has gone on long enough. I cannot be quiet." Brody turned. "What are you talking about, Jed?" "I am talking about 5 years ago," Jedediah said, taking off his hat. "I am talking about the night Samuel Turner died." Eli went rigid on the cot, his eyes locking on the old man. "I was there," Jedediah said, his voice cracking. "I was one of them, hired by the same men who wanted this land. It was supposed to be a warning, but it went wrong. It was an ambush. Sheriff, plain and simple. Samuel. He was shot in the back. Eli here, he was trying to save him. We framed him. We said he was in on it. It was a lie. All of it. To cover our own tracks and to get him off this land." The sheriff stared, speechless. "I ain't meeting my maker with that on my soul," Jedediah continued, his eyes on Eli. "Not after this. I heard what happened in town. I heard how you stood up to Henderson. And then I heard the shooting from my ridge. 5 men, 5 hired guns against 1 man and a girl, and the man they called a killer. He was just protecting his home. He is not a killer. He is not a thief. He is a better man than any of us. And we let this town ruin him." A heavy silence filled the room. The other ranchers looked at the floor, ashamed. Sheriff Brody looked at Eli. His authority, his entire world, shattered. "Eli," Brody started, his voice hollow. I did not know." Eli just stared at the old man, the weight of 5 years of hatred, 5 years of isolation, finally lifting from his wounded shoulders. His name. He had his name back. Jedediah Stone's confession hung in the air of the ruined cabin, as thick and heavy as the smell of gunpowder and blood. Sheriff Brody's face had gone pale, the cigar in his hand forgotten. He was a man watching his world, and his authority, crumble before his eyes. He looked at the old rancher, at the other grim-faced men beside him, and then at Eli, who was bleeding on the cot, a man who had just been vindicated by the very community that had exiled him. Brody was a man who survived by backing the strongest horse, and the strongest horse had just changed. "Jed, you are swearing to this?" Brody asked, his voice hollow. "You are saying, on record, that the charges against Turner were a lie?" "I am," Jedediah said, his voice firm. "And I will say it in a courtroom. I will say it to whatever judge you like. We wronged this man. We let Sterling and his backers run this county. No more. Brody looked at the dead man in the yard. Silas, an enforcer known to be on Sterling's payroll. He looked at the bullet-riddled cabin. He looked at Lila, who stood with a rifle in her hands, her eyes blazing with a cold fire that scared him more than Eli's ever had. He was cornered. The public sentiment, led by these ranchers, had turned. If he arrested Lila for defending herself, or Eli for protecting his home, he would have a war on his hands. He made his choice. "All right," Brody said, his shoulders slumping. He took off his hat, a gesture of defeat. This is a mess, but it is a mess we will clean. Jed, you will come with me. You will sign a full affidavit. As for this contract." He looked at Lila, his eyes holding a new, grudging respect. "Ma'am, Lila, I will need your testimony as well. What happened here? What Sterling did? That he sent these men? And then what?" Lila asked, her voice like ice. "You will. What? Ask him to apologize?" "And then," Brody said, his gaze hardening as he salvaged what authority he could, "I will take your testimony, and Jedediah's, and the evidence of this," he gestured to the dead man, "and I will inform Mr. Sterling that his indenture contract is null and void, that it was, in fact, an instrument of kidnapping and coercion, and that if he ever tries to enforce it, or sends another man near this ranch, I will personally arrest him for conspiracy to commit murder. Am I understood?" It was the only way out for him, and they all knew it. By officially recognizing the truth, he could save his own position, paint himself as the man who restored order, and cut Sterling loose. The saloon owner's power, built on intimidation and lies, could not survive the truth. Not when the truth had a body count. Lila looked at Eli. He was weak, but he was watching, and he gave a single, slow nod. "All right, Sheriff," Lila said, lowering the rifle, her shoulders finally slumping as the last of the adrenaline drained away, leaving her weak-kneed. "I will sign your paper." "Good," Brody said. He turned to the other ranchers. "Pike, Harris, get that body out of his yard. We will take it back with us. Jed, let's go." As the men worked, Jedediah Stone walked over to the cot. He stood over Eli, his ancient, weathered face a mask of shame. "Son," he said, his voice thick, I cannot ask you to forgive me. What I did, what we did, it cost you your brother. It will cost you 5 years. I am sorry." Eli looked at the old man for a long time. The hatred he had carried, a cold, hard stone in his gut for half a decade, had vanished in the gunfire. All he felt was tired. "You told the truth," Eli whispered, his voice ravaged. "That is enough. Go on, Jed, get it done." Jedediah nodded, tears in his eyes, and left. Eli was weak. The fever, held at bay by Lila's desperate care, lingered. He slept for days, the wound in his shoulder healing slowly, painfully. The cauterization had saved his life but left a scar that puckered the skin, a permanent reminder of the fight. Lila nursed him. She cleaned the cabin, scrubbing the blood from the floorboards until her knuckles were raw. She mended the bullet holes in the walls, filling them with mud and clay. She fixed the shattered window, covering it with a piece of stretched hide, making the cabin dim, but safe. And as she worked, and as Eli healed, outside, the world was reborn. Spring arrived, not with the violence of the thaw, as if it were finally safe to show its face. The endless, hungry mud dried, replaced by the first shy shoots of green grass. The creek, which had run brown with silt, now ran clear and fast, the sound of it a bright, constant murmur. Wildflowers exploded over the hillsides, patches of Indian paintbrush, like daubs of red paint, mixed with the pale purple of lupine and the bright, sunny faces of wild daisies. The air, once sharp with ice and fear, now smelled of damp, rich earth, of pine resin warming in the sun, and of the sweet, subtle perfume of new blossoms, The ranch, which had been a dead, gray place, came back to life. As Eli grew stronger, he would sit in the new chair he had built, his arm in a sling, and watch Lila. She had changed. The haunted, hollow-eyed ghost he had found in his barn was gone. The woman who remained was quiet. Yes, but her quietness was one of strength, not fear. She found a small, sun-drenched patch of earth behind the cabin, near the creek. She took Eli's shovel, a tool almost as tall as she was, and began to dig. She turned the soil, her movements awkward but determined, breaking up the clods of earth with her hands. Eli watched her from the porch. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice still rough. "I am planting a garden," she called back, not stopping. She wiped a streak of dark, rich soil from her forehead. "I found some dried seeds in your pantry, beans and squash, and I am hoping for tomatoes." He had never thought to plant a garden. He had lived on hunted meat, beans, and flour. A garden was an act of faith. It was a promise that you would be there, in that same spot, months from now, to harvest. She worked from sunup to sundown. She built a small, crooked fence around it to keep the rabbits out. She watered it every morning, carrying buckets from the creek. She would talk to the small patch of turned earth, encouraging the seeds to grow. She was putting down roots. She did not stop there. She found a stack of scrap lumber behind the barn, left over from when he and Samuel had built the stalls. She dragged it, piece by piece, to a spot near her garden. "Now what?" Eli asked, a small smile playing on his lips. "A chicken coop," she announced, her face serious. "We need eggs. I am tired of bacon." She could barely lift the hammer, but she refused his help. He was still healing. She hammered, her blows clumsy, the nails bending. She swore, a quiet, frustrated sound, and tried again. She built a small, lopsided but sturdy box. "I will buy you chickens, next time I go to town," Eli promised, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. She was dreaming of a future. She was building a home, not just for him, but for herself. She had given up the thought of running, not because she was trapped, but because she belonged. One evening, a week later, Eli was strong enough to ride. His shoulder ached, a dull, deep throb, but his strength was returning. He saddled both Daisy and Buster. "Where are we going?" Lila asked, wiping her hands on her apron. She had made it from a clean flour sack. "I want to show you something," he said. He helped her mount Daisy. He rode beside her, not along the creek bed, the path of ambush, but up the high ridge to the north. They climbed steadily, the air growing thinner and cooler. They reached the summit just as the sun was beginning its long, slow descent. The view was breathtaking. From here, they could see everything. The entire valley spread out below them, a lush, green bowl carved into the plains. Their ranch was a tiny, perfect miniature by the silver thread of the creek. They could see the dark line of the hills to the east, where Laramie lay, and the vast, empty expanse of grassland to the west, stretching all the way to the mountains, which were capped with the last of the winter snow, glowing pink in the evening light. "Eli," Lila whispered. I never knew the world was this big. I have only ever seen the bottoms of things. The valley, the alley, the floor of the saloon. This was my mother's place," Eli said, his voice quiet. He dismounted, wincing as he put weight on his arm. "She used to come up here. She said it was the only place she could see God stitching. After Samuel died. I never came back. It was too quiet." Lila slipped off Daisy and stood beside him, her small hand finding his. They stood in silence, watching the shadows lengthen, the world painted in shades of gold and purple. "It is not quiet anymore," Lila said softly. Eli turned to her. The wind on the ridge was gentle, pulling strands of her dark hair from their pins. Her face, which had been so pale and thin, now had a healthy color, her eyes clear and deep. He saw the woman she was, the woman she had always been, buried beneath the pain. "I'm healed," he said. "The doctor in town said my name is cleared. Jedediah's affidavit. It is done. The town. They They apologized. Pike, Henderson, they offered me credit. They are just scared, Lila said. No, Eli said. They are just men. They were wrong, and they know it. It does not matter. The past is done. But I need to know about the future. He took her hand, his large, scarred palm enveloping hers. Lila, you are free. Brody delivered the papers. Sterling's contract is ash. You can go anywhere you want. You could go east. You could go to California. You could leave this valley and never look back. Her heart tightened. Is that? What do you want? No, he said, his voice raw. I want you to stay. I want you to stay here. With me. Forever. I want to build more rooms in that cabin. I want to watch your garden grow. I want a life. With you. Lila stared at him. Her lips parted. This was it. The final, terrifying choice. Not to run, not to hide, but to stay. Eli, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. How can you ask me that? How can you want me? After all I have been, after what I have done, what was done to me, I am damaged goods. I am the saloon's whore. I am not clean. The words, the old ugly labels, fell from her. The last of the poison. Eli's expression did not change. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He reached out with his good hand and cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear. I do not care about what you have been, he said, his voice fierce and low. I care about what you are, and you are not damaged. You are a survivor. I look at you, and I do not see what Sterling did. I see the woman who walked 20 miles barefoot in the snow. I see the woman who delivered a foal in a blizzard. I see the woman who stood in my window and shot Silas in the chest to save my life. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. Especially after all you have been. He whispered, you are still standing, and I am a better man for standing next to you. She let out a sob, a sound of profound, aching release, and kissed him. It was a kiss of acceptance, of wonder, of a future she had never, ever believed she would have. Yes, she wept against his lips. Yes, Eli, I will stay. Yes, that night, the cabin was no longer a fortress, no longer a refuge. It was simply home. The small, dim room, with its new chair and its mended walls, was warm, the air soft with the smell of the pine logs burning in the hearth. Eli had healed. Lila was free. The past was buried, and the future was a clean, open plain, like the one they had seen from the ridge. He came to her, where she sat in the rocking chair, brushing her long, dark hair. He knelt before her, taking the brush from her hand. He ran it through her hair, his movements slow, tender. This was not the desperate, raw need of their past encounters. This was not about survival. This was a celebration. He lifted her from the chair and carried her to his bed. The cot, her old bed, was now folded in the corner, a relic of a time that was gone. He laid her down, and for the first time, he made love to her without fear, without the shadow of Sterling's cane, without the sound of gunfire in their ears. It was slow. It was passionate. It was a quiet, profound claim, a relearning of each other in this new, peaceful world. His touch was reverent, his kisses long and deep. He worshipped the scars she carried, both visible and invisible, and she clung to him, marveling at the strength in his gentleness, at the sheer, simple goodness of the man who had saved her, and who she had saved in return. It was a love earned through survival, a bond forged in blood and ice, and it was stronger than any force on earth. The story closes a week later. They are sitting on the porch, in the 2 chairs he had built, hers rocking gently, his solid and still. The sun had set, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple, the first stars beginning to prick through. Lila was leaning her head on his good shoulder, her hand resting on his knee. Eli's hand, scarred and calloused, covered hers. They watched the dusk settle over their valley. A hawk circled high overhead, its cry a sharp, lonely sound. In the far distance, from the hills, a coyote howled, the sound echoed by its pack. It was the sound of the wild, the sound of the land. The wind, which had once screamed like a banshee, now soughed through the pines. It was no longer a threat. It was a song. "This land," Eli said, his voice a low rumble in the twilight, his gaze on the darkening hills. "It gave me nothing for so long. It took my brother. It took my name. It gave me nothing until it gave me you." Lila squeezed his hand, her heart too full to speak. He lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles. Together, they sat in the gathering dark, two broken souls made whole, and began their new life. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment and let us know. If you enjoyed this tale, we hope you will consider subscribing to From Wild West. And please share your thoughts on the story. We love hearing from you.